30 years ago, I made a road movie called Radio On. And in those days, you shot on 35 millimeter, you cut on a Steenbeck. It was a very linear process. The journey, you went from A to B physically, and after some time, you met a person in the story of the film, talked a bit, then played some music, moved on. And coming back to the format of the road movie 30 years later, I was thinking how much has changed. Everything has changed. And if the brothers Lumiere had watched us filming Radio On, they would have understood the process. They would have recognized what we were doing. If they'd seen us filming content and editing it, they would not have had a clue as to what we were doing. And I also thought that now we move away from the linear into the non-linear and away from the real into the virtual, then you're telling a completely different kind of story. And so very much in the way that Radio On in 1979 was about the technology of that time, of having, being able to play music in a car, content which was made in 2009 is also about the technology that's available today. So it's a kind of journey from celluloid to memory stick. The film became a reflection on mortality. It didn't set out to do so. It actually set out to try and explain in a more wider documentary way the crash of 2008. And at first I thought that I would go out and make a lot of conventional interviews with people to explain what had happened, because it really was the end. I mean, to go back to Radio On, it really was the end of a 30-year economic span, because in 1979, when we made Radio On, just after that we got Margaret Thatcher, and that lasted really in economic terms to 2008. So I anticipated a fairly more conventional documentary. I had the idea of a certain amount of driving, but then in the end, the budget restrictions of the film meant that I did a lot more driving. And in fact, the American footage was not part of the film at all. It was actually a holiday I took with my wife Emma Matthews, who's the editor anyway of the film. And our son was sitting in the back of the car, and she filmed him to keep him quiet. And it wasn't until we came to the cutting that we looked at the boy and we said, well, he's very good. And she said, well, he also looks like you did at that age. And so you have this silent judge sitting in the back of the car. And it really came out, that theme developed from the material that was available, as always, really. But yes, in the end, it became more about that. I started off by driving up and down that Westway extension of London, that kind of concrete, I think J.G. Ballard called it stone dream. And I thought that in making the film then, I decided I didn't want to do what I set out to do, which was to make a documentary explanation. I thought it becomes much more interesting if it becomes archaeological. So it's like you're excavating the present, but from a point of view which is actually far in the future. So it's trying to imagine yourself as a kind of time traveler. And in a way, the car now has become the perfect capsule for this, because it no longer represents the freedom of 30 or 50 or 60 years ago. It's like a little kind of traveling pod which isolates you from everything else. And the other thing that interested me was the idea of, which again is a kind of archaeological thing, that history is both a timeline, but it's like a series of rooms. that you can really walk from one room into the next in a historical sense. And thinking, as I kind of get older, that in some ways the past, the middle past or the distant past, is much closer than the recent past. You know, you live with moments of your past all the time, and so it was an effort both to expand time and also kind of collapse it. That's the most coherent I can be about it. Well, I hope in the way that they would be able to construct something that they could understand, but it would look rather like an Escher drawing, that the stairway wouldn't connect to the doorway, and the cellar wouldn't be at the bottom, it would be at the top, but they would look at it and think, yes, this is how it was, and rather like Escher, it is and it isn't. So I think this was the and making the film. We constantly had no point of reference. We couldn't work out what we were doing in terms of, is it like this, or because normally you say, oh, it's a bit like that, and we take a bit of that. It's you normally have references, and this film we were completely blind. It was a huge effort. I mean, to get it like that, we started off with it's a little bit like a horse race. In a horse race, you need 12 horses. But in the end, only 3 count. And in this, we had far too much content. We had far too much material. And I kept saying to Emma, well, in the end, we're not going to need all of this, but I can't tell yet what we don't need. And this carried on like this for weeks. We couldn't work out what to lose. And I mean, in the end, she said to me, well, normally you pull the film out of the dive before this stage, because it really looked like we were going straight into the ground. But at the end, I think we were able to make the decisions very quickly. But it was only through this process of exhaustive recutting, version 50, version 60, version 75, and you get to version 75 and you think, well, what was in version 50? And it was always, to learn what to reduce, to take out. But it was much harder work than it should be.